Tu Diep. Hello, everyone. Love can sometimes feel too different, too fragile, yet James and Tu Diep have held on, trying against the odds. But when CEO James's company suddenly faces bankruptcy, the world they built together begins to tremble. Can their love withstand the storm? Or will Tu Diep be forced to lean on a man whose future is crumbling beneath him in the shadows of uncertainty? The true strength of their hearts will be revealed. The scent of ripe pears filled the air as Diep hurried back from the distant market, her hands rough from a day of harvest. She was late again. The small, wooden house at the edge of the field was silent except for the soft scratching of a crayon. Inside, CEO James, a man whose tailored suits once commanded the glittering boardrooms of the city, was kneeling beside Little Knee. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows. Flour dusted his palms, and a pot of chicken soup simmered on the stove. He had left behind meetings and contracts to be here, to fill a space in a child's heart, and, perhaps, in Diep's. When Diep finally stepped through the door, Knee's laughter and the warm aroma of dinner wrapped around her like an embrace. James glanced up, his dark eyes shining with a tenderness that didn't belong to the cutthroat world he came from. At the table, after prayers whispered for strength, James quietly asked Knee if she would call Diep mother. The little girl's voice trembled as she obeyed, tears spilling as if that single word carried all the longing of her short life. Diep bent down, hugging her close, whispering promises to love and protect her. For a moment, the world outside, the debts, the rivals, the fragile walls of James's empire ceased to exist. But James's phone vibrated against the wooden table, a harsh reminder of reality. His company, once a titan in agriculture and infrastructure, was unraveling. Investments had been withdrawn overnight, projects frozen mid-construction, and whispers of betrayal coiled through the boardroom. Rumors said that John, a former ally-turned-rival, had orchestrated the financial sabotage. To the world, James was a powerful CEO, but tonight, as he watched Diep wash the dishes and Knee hum softly over her drawings, he felt like a man on borrowed time. Diep noticed the distant look in his eyes. She had grown up with hardship, bare feet on muddy fields, selling vegetables to survive, carrying the weight of responsibility far too young. She knew what it meant to fight even when your hands were bleeding. Stepping closer, she reached for his hand. "We will find a way," she whispered, but her heart trembled. Love between a city-born executive and a village girl was already fragile, too different. Could their bond survive the storm that was coming? The days that followed were a blur of collapsing contracts and late-night strategy calls. James borrowed money, confronted shareholders, and even considered sacrificing his reputation to protect his employees. There were nights he pretended to be strong, holding Diep as if her steady heartbeat could drown out the noise of failure. There were moments when she wondered if loving him meant living in a shadow of crises she didn't choose. But when she watched him kneel beside Knee, carefully teaching her how to hold a pencil straight or praising her uneven drawings, she saw the man behind the CEO, the man who chose kindness when the world chose greed. At dawn, under the pale light spilling across the fields, Diep stood beside James. He looked worn, but there was fire in his gaze. "John thinks he can destroy me," he said quietly. "But this isn't just about business anymore. It's about the life we're building." Diep squeezed his hand, knowing the road ahead would demand every ounce of courage they had. Love was not easy. Love was too different, two worlds colliding, two hearts learning to trust. But as the first rays of sun touched the earth, Diep decided she would not walk away. And James, even as his empire trembled, silently vowed to fight for her, for Knee, for the fragile dream they were weaving together. No one knew how long they could endure, but in that fleeting, golden morning, the promise of love felt stronger than the storm. The following evening, the wind carried the smell of rain over the fields, and thunder rumbled in the distance like a warning. James had been on the phone for hours, pacing the small porch, his voice low but tense. Diep stood by the window, drying Knee's hair after a bath, trying to pretend she wasn't listening. "They're pulling out the last of their investment," James muttered into the receiver. "If I don't find another partner, the factory will shut down in a week." When the call ended, he leaned against the wooden post, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Diep placed a blanket around Knee and stepped outside. "You look like the sky," she said softly, nodding toward the storm clouds, dark and heavy. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know if I can fix this." She took his hand, her fingers calloused but warm. You don't have to fix it alone. The storm broke that night, rain slamming against the roof while Nee slept in the corner room. James and Deep sat at the table under the dim light, papers spread between them, contracts, loan requests, unpaid bills. She didn't understand all the numbers, but she listened, offered simple, grounded thoughts, and reminded him of the community that still trusted him. Her quiet faith steadied him more than any business plan. 2 days later, James drove into the city to meet Min, a respected CEO known for his fairness, but also his hidden feelings for Deep. Min greeted James with a polite smile, but there was a glimmer of rivalry in his eyes. They discussed the bridge construction project, James's last chance to save his company. Min tapped the table thoughtfully. "I'll consider partnering with you," he said, "but not out of pity. This has to be a fair fight." On the way home, James replayed the conversation in his head. Min's interest in Deep was no secret to him. The thought gnawed at his pride and his heart, but he forced himself to focus on the future. That night, when Deep welcomed him back with a warm bowl of soup and a tired smile, he silently promised himself not to let jealousy break them. As days turned into weeks, they worked side by side. Deep sold vegetables at the market, saving every coin. James negotiated deals and rallied the few investors who still believed in him. In the evenings, they shared quiet dinners, laughed with Nee over her drawings, and whispered dreams of a better future. But the threat of John's schemes still loomed. One afternoon, James's brother arrived breathless with news. John had bribed a key supplier to cut off James's resources. Without materials, even Min's potential partnership would crumble. James's jaw tightened, but he refused to panic. He called Deep, his voice calm. "This isn't the end. I have a plan." Late that night, he met secretly with his brother under the old willow tree near the river. They plotted a countermove, investing a small sum into a rival project to lure John into revealing his next steps. If they could expose him, they might win back the trust of the other investors. Back at the farmhouse, Deep couldn't sleep. She sat beside Nee's bed, watching the child breathe peacefully. She thought about the life she had chosen, a life that was never simple. James's world was foreign to her. Boardrooms, betrayals, and numbers with too many zeros. Yet when she imagined walking away, her chest ached. Love wasn't supposed to be easy. The next morning, as the sun broke through the storm clouds, Deep went outside to the pear trees. Their branches were heavy with fruit again, a reminder that seasons change and hardships don't last forever. She whispered to the wind, as if sending her words to James across the fields, "We will survive this. We have to." At the city's financial district, James stepped into Min's office once more, a new fire in his eyes. "I'm not here to beg," he said. "I'm here to prove that even in the worst storm, I won't abandon what matters." Min studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Somewhere beneath the rivalry, there was respect. Far away, Deep watched Nee chase chickens in the yard, her laughter ringing through the morning air. The world might tear at the fragile threads of their happiness, but for now, love still held, and as long as James kept fighting and Deep kept believing, maybe, just maybe, their two different love could outlast the storm. That night, James returned home late, the headlights of his truck sweeping across the yard where the pear trees stood like silent guardians. Deep had left the porch light on for him. Nee was already asleep, her little hand curled around a crayon-streaked page of fish and flowers. Deep waited on the steps, wrapped in a faded shawl. The smell of rain still lingered, mixed with the faint aroma of chicken soup from dinner. James sat beside her without a word. For a while, they just listened to the crickets and the distant rush of the river. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Min has agreed to consider the bridge project. But he's cautious, and John, he's already setting another trap." Deep rested her head on his shoulder. "I know you're tired. I'm more than tired," he admitted. "I'm scared." She turned her face toward him, surprised by the confession. The world saw James as unshakable, a man who could build empires. But here, under the modest porch light, he was just a man with calloused hands and a breaking heart. She held his hand tightly. "Fear doesn't make you weak," she said. "It makes you human." In the following days, tension grew. Anonymous threats arrived at James's office, messages warning him to give up or risk everything. Some nights, the sound of a car idling too long on the road outside made Deep's stomach twist with worrying. James installed new locks and became more protective, making sure Deep and Nee were never alone. Despite the pressure, there were small, tender moments that kept them going. One morning, as they harvested pears together, Nee skipped between the trees singing a silly song. James watched Deep laugh, her hair catching the sunlight, and for a heartbeat, the weight on his shoulders lifted. But reality returned quickly. Min visited the farm to discuss final terms. His polished shoes sank slightly into the damp earth as he walked the rows of trees with Deep, complimenting her on the fruit and her determination. James watched from a distance, jealousy flickering in his chest, even as he reminded himself that Min had been fair. That evening, James found Deep on the porch again, her eyes thoughtful. "Min respects you," she said gently. "But I think he's also drawn to me," James exhaled. The jealousy sharp. "I know," he paused, then added, "I can't ask you to hide your kindness. But I need to know we're strong enough." Even when someone else tries to step between us, Deep reached for his hand. "We are, but strength doesn't mean we won't feel the cracks." 2 days later, the trap was sprung. John arranged for a shipment of critical materials to be accidentally diverted, leaving James's team stranded mid-project. The sabotage was meant to destroy his reputation completely. But James's brother, following the plan they had set under the willow tree, caught one of John's men in the act. They recorded everything: the bribery, the orders, the confession that John's grudge was rooted in a land dispute between their families years ago. That night, James returned to the farmhouse with the evidence. He set the recorder on the table, the flicker of hope in his eyes for the first time in weeks. Deep covered her mouth, relief and disbelief washing over her. "Does this mean?" "It means," James interrupted softly, "we have a chance." But even as they embraced, he knew the battle wasn't over. John was powerful and desperate, and exposing him would ignite a war in the business world. Deep's voice trembled. "Whatever happens next, promise me you'll come back to us." James held her face between his hands, his forehead resting against hers. "I promise." "But Deep, love like ours, it's different. It's fragile and fierce all at once, and the world will try to break it." She closed her eyes, letting the sound of the river fill the silence. "Then let the world try," she whispered. "We're still here." As dawn crept over the fields, the pear trees shimmered with dew, and the farmhouse stood steady against the horizon. In the quiet, a fragile hope bloomed, a hope that even storms, betrayals, and impossible differences could not undo the love they had chosen, again and again. This story teaches us that love is not only about romance or perfect circumstances, it is about resilience, trust, and shared effort, even when the world feels unstable. James and Deep come from very different worlds. He is a CEO surrounded by power struggles, while she is a humble, hardworking woman who knows hardship. Their bond is tested by betrayal, financial ruin, jealousy, and fear. Yet what keeps them together is not wealth or status, but kindness, honesty, and the willingness to stand side by side through storms. It reminds us that relationships cannot survive on feelings alone. They require patience when plans fail, understanding when mistakes happen, and forgiveness when pride is wounded. Even when love seems too different, it can endure if both people fight for it, protecting each other, sharing burdens, and refusing to let outside forces decide their fate. Ultimately, the lesson is clear: true love grows stronger, not in moments of ease, but in the struggles that reveal who we really are and how deeply we are willing to care for someone else.